And in talking about one landscape, two data environments, really we'll take this time to look at some of the challenges data presents in the field. And as a geographer, it's very much a physical landscape that we can see and really engage in, and something we have to go to and participate in really to understand the data, the accuracy of the data, and what we might be able to do with it. So looking at the environment in China and Mongolia, I work with the Chinese Academy of Sciences, and in Mongolia, the Mongolian Institute of Geography and the National University. So it's based with local people in the idea that they can also bring their insights into their own countries, into the research, rather than just the outsider going there and trying to figure out what's happening. So when we look at the landscape, these pictures, it could be in China, it could be in Mongolia. The idea is it's one landscape, but yet the data environment comes out to be quite differently. So my work in particular looks at climate hazards in the Gobi Desert. As we can see, extreme winters to minus 30 degrees on both sides of the border, drought, precipitation, these issues are very important. And also the very data-heavy factors. So if I'm looking at climate records, I need to know about the data I'm using, where I'm getting it from, what its validity is. So in a geography sense, the data is quite tangible. The first thing we need to know is what's the access to data? Can we actually get the information we need? And is it even been recorded? And will it be available to us? How are we going to collect the information? Can I go to the field? Do people have it? Can they share it? Is there some government policy that might prevent this? A big issue is the accuracy of data, how valid it is. Can we investigate this? Can we verify this information? Also, the context becomes very important, and this is where the politics come in, governance, how people think of their environment, what story they want to tell locally that might be different from what we, coming from the UK, want to investigate. And then at the end, if we have this data, are there ways to use it in an applied method? Will there be interest in it, or will particularly the local people not think it's relevant and that it's just an academic exercise? So I take you to the Gobi Desert, this white area, hope you can see. It's near Beijing, and from there it goes to the capital of Mongolia, Ulaanbaatar. It's about the third largest desert in the world, so it is quite large, covers lots of space. And if you think about it, historically, this is the land of Genghis Khan, of nomads roaming on the steppes, and even today, that's really the image most people have of this area. If you know a little bit more about it, this area here, Inner Mongolia, is actually China's main domestic energy source. So their perspective of it might be quite different from ours because they see it as a great source of coal, rare earth elements like that are very profitable, and it changes their version of what the landscape purpose is in their society. So I'll start with presentation. So when we're looking at data, we might be given something and we have to interpret it and see what it really means and how useful it is for us. So I start with a picture from the Gobi of an idyllic monastery lost amongst the sand dunes that looks very much this past romanticized view of what deserts are. So that's what we're presented with on the surface, but if we do a little more investigation, we see the reality is actually quite different than what's handed to us. So what we don't see in the first picture is that actually it's a tourist resort now. There's a paved road into the monastery, there's a car park, there's a hotel complex. And not only that, but to make sure the hotel complex, et cetera, can function, water is now piped into the lake. So in that way, I have to question the data or my interpretation of this because it's not really the first picture, it's the second picture that we're dealing with today. So in a desert, doesn't matter where you are really, water becomes the key factor if you're going to involve people. So on one side in Mongolia, we see a man with a rope and a bucket at the end watering his animals. So his version of data, or what we're going to have available there, is constrained by the level of development. And if we just go 200 kilometers south of this gentleman, this is the water system on the Chinese side. And what we see here is a box, so what we really need to learn is that there's a card everybody needs to access the water meter that's inside. So you need to first access the box, you need a swipe card, you need to have enough credit or amount of water available given to you by the government to actually activate the water system so you can get any water. So in one area we may have free access to water but not very well developed. Another area there may be water available and the infrastructure to support it, but access then is controlled. So when both sides tell me about the amount of water they have, I need to really understand what it means in their own context. So when you have a more developed system like we see here with the water meters, it means water is used differently. It goes from being used for animals and people to farming, and as we see in some of the pictures, it's not really a farming landscape, which I'll touch on a little later, and that again relates to the context of who's in these areas. Both sides talk about the livestock and the livelihoods dependent on it. So when I first went out there, I imagined what I've seen in movies of people riding horses across the steppe. But actually, in China, this gentleman can have 8 cows and make a living from the milk. And he has a little brick house, a little yard, a little patch there. And the animals actually never leave that area. So that's one distinct way of raising livestock. In Mongolia, you see this man with tens of horses, hundreds of animals, going from place to access the vegetation. So quickly you realize we have 2 very different systems going on. Clearly the man with the cattle has a different source of fodder for the animals like that. It means you have to buy the fodder, bring it in. It really involves you in an economic system that takes certain tools and certain information for us to process, whereas the other gentleman is much more left alone. And so we have 2 different uses of the landscape that when I read numbers on a page, I may not realize how different the conditions really are. So this goes back maybe to history and historical perceptions of the Gobi. And this is one of my favorite maps. It's actually was on a shelf in the Bodleian Library for 350 years. And in 2008, a researcher found it and decided it might have some implications. So what we see is in the 1600s how China conceived itself. We have Beijing up there with a star, but we can see where the Great Wall is, and it's this area below and inside the Great Wall that is China's conception of what the Chinese civilization is. And beyond it, the empty space, that's the Gobi Desert. So when we talk about the Gobi Desert today, part of what we need to know is how it's conceived and how it has been dealt with in the past by these 2 societies. And we can't read it, but there's a little inscription in the map that says, beware of barbarians to the north. So it's very much this other beyond the civilized area of China. But then if we move forward a few hundred years to post-World War II, we see another conception of the Gobi area. So this becomes important because when Mao and the communists take control, data becomes something to justify the state organizations and the state's decisions. So it's not important if the data is accurate or not, it's important if it suits the purpose of the state at the time. So that's something that starts coloring your data environment and lingers on till today, as I'll mention. But whereas we may think of data as just numbers, especially when it's climate data or physical data, amount of water in the stream, sometimes it's going to serve a different purpose. And we need to know that if we're going to evaluate the data we're dealing with. If we go to Mongolia, Soviet satellite state till 1990, you can see that they take a little different approach. This is the Lenin Museum, more recently in Mongolia, now a billiards parlor. So you can see there's a little less reverence to the past and how they were taught or trained to pursue data. And so we also need to know that though they both were communist, and maybe in the West we regard them as with some similarities, there's some difference. In Mongolia with the Russians and the Soviets, the data was important for itself. It didn't have to meet state aims. So what we see even today is Mongolians are good at recording numbers, and they have lots of numbers, lots of data on the physical environment, but they don't spend much time on analysis. So we may have a lot of data, and it may have some validity, but we're not going to look to the state to interpret it and tell us what they want us to think about it. So as a researcher, it has some potential in that way. So as we all modernize and develop, Mongolia and China also put their data together and want to provide it to us. And this is an interesting situation. When a professor in Inner Mongolia gave me the 2012 Inner Mongolia Statistical Yearbook, it's maybe 3+ inches thick, and he hands it to me very nicely and says, some of the data may be true. So it's a very different approach than what we think here, where we accept that the data must have some truth to it, that is based on that. So as researchers in China, particularly in the rural areas, may know, data serves a different purpose. It's not always carefully collected. If you're in rural areas, the way you advance is by meeting the 5-year plans of the district, of the province, like that. So data is always very positive. So you always wonder, at some point, are we going to get so high it's over 100% of whatever it is they're talking about. In Mongolia, it's maybe less than an inch thick. The statistical yearbook, it's for the entire country. It's in English and Mongolian, so there's much less data there. But what there is more valuable, more usable as a researcher, because it's just numbers they've collected, and here it is, go do what you want with it. So though there's much less of it, it's more robust in a research context when we want to use it. And then when we're trying to collect data or pursue research toward new possible data or information, the ability to engage in the environment becomes important. You see a picture of Mongolia, a road I've been down, well, a dirt track that's not far from the border. I can tell you about the water quality in the little well that you might not even recognize. But in that environment, that this is what they deal with. So our research has to be ready for this, and can we access it? Can we get some information that's useful and build on that? And then if we go from Mongolia into China, we see the kissing dinosaurs, the 4-lane highway, and so right off you know you're in a totally different environment, and that your research will have different angles to it. So born of the nomadic tradition, mobility, both sides talk about this, researchers talk about it, but once you show up, you realize it's quite a different thing. The little boy has his baby goat on moving day in Mongolia. On the other side, it's still Mongolian people, but they're in these brick little houses. And I asked them, so you said it's mobile herding, where's the mobility? And so the little director of this little village says, oh, some days they take the animals on the left side of the road, some days on the right side of the road. But what we know is researchers over time, if you're settled and you have all these animals and they're going over the same area all the time, it's going to have some impact on the environment. So that's what ends up driving some of what we might deal with, because it's not really this idea of moving that I might have in my own mind. Then we get to how data is presented. I was actually in a house when a government official came by and handed out this paper, which is basically a no herding notice. And I'd been in the area several weeks, and I've been to maybe 6 different districts, and they were all always said the grasslands are 85% degraded. So the first guy wrote it down. The second guy wrote it down again. By the third time I was told that, I stopped writing it down and wondered what was happening. So what it means is it really data? Is it new data? Or is it some statement that has been well disseminated that people are repeating? So I don't know that it's really 85% degraded or not, because the purpose of this paper is to stop people from herding and to reduce the number of animals they have. So when the numbers start repeating and repeating, then I either need to find another way to verify this or to have great caveat if I use it, because it's not established where these numbers come from. So though they say here's all the data you'll need, I don't know. And then I always get scared when there's a grassland supervision surveillance administration. So it tells me it's not just researchers or local people just saying how many animals they have or what the environment's like. So this goes back to kind of the malware, where it serves another purpose, and the environment is just one factor of many to persuade people or to affect. Also in the area, a big topic is desertification. So there's great ideas of these anti-desertification plans. We have examples from both sides of the border. I don't think either one will be very successful, but for different reasons, certainly. In Mongolia, we see some officials planting a tree, and I don't know where they got the tree from. There aren't so many like that, but just think, who's going to water it? Or what happens when it's minus 30? Who's going to protect it? How's it going to be kept from freezing in the winter? So it's an idea, but is it really logical? And though some time is spent on it, I'm not sure it's a very practical measure. But then across the way in China, there's this great plan, the Great Green Wall, the 56 billion trees that are being planted across the Gobi to keep the sands out and protect the more settled areas. But even though this is mentioned in many academic papers, if you go out there and you see these shrubs, they're made of plastic. So that's why they're all perfectly the same shape and it's perfectly the same green. So if your data source turns out to be plastic, then it's not very good. So without going out there, I would never have known this, and I might too cite that 56 billion trees are being planted. I might have to say 1 billion of them are plastic or something in the next version. But we don't know these things till we go out there and realize these factors that affect our ability to either collect data or collect accurate data. One example in the area, mining is very big. On one side, Mongolians are digging for gold with a shovel. So it has certainly environmental impact. It's a small scale. In China, near Zhuhai, they've used major equipment to make this kind of lunar landscape. And you can see there's actually some animals walking through a path there. So what it starts telling us is the capacity and what's happening in both sides is very different. The scale is just all different, though we're in the same environment. And that leads us to the capacity of your research area and the data you might be able to get. And so on one side, China's sending rockets into space. This is where their space program is based in Inner Mongolia. So they have great technical capacity. So lots of information, lots of data generated. But from my previous experience, then I need to question for environmental research what's going to be real or relevant. And then Mongolia, they have some mobile phones and some coverage, and they're quite happy with that. And so the capabilities are so different, though we're just talking about one landscape. The two capital cities in the area. There's no natural lake in Inner Mongolia, but this is the Yellow River diverted, built up there. The social conception of what a city should be like, so it should have water, high rises like that. So certainly different capacities, different orientations in the two areas of a very simple place in Mongolia, reflecting the two research environments and the development of each level. Then interpretation becomes another thing. So even if we have data, even if we agree on the data source, then what does it mean? So from a paper just showing the red line how the size of the Gobi Desert has decreased, and this is through 2012. So one side tells me, of course, more rainfall, there's going to be more vegetation, so the fringes of the desert will shift. Another side tells me, well, Troy, that represents a strong government policy. It's very effective what our government's doing, and that's what works in that environment. But of course, the problem is if the red line ever goes back up, which is apt to, what's that say about the government policy at that point? So for my work, it's much better if it's grounded in environmental fact rather than cherry picking your data that's going to suit your political aims. Both sides, it's nice to say there's some very good researchers that are enthusiastic, that can work on an international level. So even though you may be far away from your colleagues or people that you might interact with, there's lots of knowledge there that's possible. It's a matter of, can these people express themselves and have access to what we might say, progressing through a career where their voice can also be heard, rather than always just the outsiders talking for them. But given that there are still many issues in the way people conceive of research and what data is. So I've been told the government gives us the questions, our job is to find the answers. So that's a very unusual approach for PhDs to take to research, but that's out there. Another is, if you don't have permission, the research is invalid. So if I were to go to parts of Inner Mongolia, I'll show you, or Tibet, it wouldn't matter even if I had something to say if the government didn't say that. And what I hear most frequently, research is over, we have a banquet scheduled. So the orientation is around food or other things that are culturally important rather than necessarily around the research that we might think or the approach we might take elsewhere. And on the other side, it's a free country, we can say what we want. Two very different approaches to one set environment. So I think much of it reflects the government policy, what's available, a rather quaint government center in Mongolia, a very monolithic place in China. And these towns are about similar populations, about 20 to 30,000. So it's not like we're at a major center, but it certainly expresses the power of the government in different scenarios. So we need to think about what's the agenda, the social agenda, what information is going to be available when we're doing research, how open both sides are, how open a society will be to researchers. What's the goal? Is it to write papers? Is it to justify some government policy? Is it a report? Is it to get people visas to come to UK for exchanges? There are many different factors. And of course, what's the social or the economic factors that are going to drive our research and our access to these data things. And what the sign says in China says, don't let the sand dunes swallow Minchin County. So it's very much Mao's man over nature. So they have this nice statue, but if you go up there and stand there and look out, all you see is the desert. So they've planted thousands of trees, but without the necessary support, it's not going to work. So even though my research may be environmental, it really comes down to human interaction with the environment. So you can't do one really without the other. I have to, it leads on to these next couple slides about protest. In Mongolia, they took their horses in front of the parliament. No problem there. This is in Inner Mongolia, China. And the reason I mention it is because I was scheduled to do field work there in 2011. There was an incident where some coal trucks ran over some Mongolian herders and killed them, a small protest, and then the entire province is blocked off to all foreigners. So if you're trying to plan research, you can't plan these things in very well. But once you're in China, I was in Beijing at the time, then such events and the randomness of them certainly impact your ability to do your research. And if it was one time only, I might have not really noticed it, but 2 years later in Western China, we had tickets to Urumqi to do some research out there. I was very excited to go to this area, but days before we left, the entire trip was canceled by the government. And so, of course, asking why is it canceled, the reason is the civil war in Syria makes it dangerous in Western China. So this really colors one's view of what research is possible. And that leads me to my next to last slide about the controls on research. And they're certainly different in different places. So in Mongolia, leaving the capital, you pay your 16p road toll, and then you're free for 1,000 miles. You can go wherever you want around the countryside. It's quite nice. in China. My last 2 visits have ended up with the police, and there's no picture because they don't allow pictures, but it leaves a different sense of what research possibility there are when the police stop you and take your documents, take you into the police station, and like that. So it really tells you maybe this isn't a place that's open for research after all. And my last slide. So some of the challenges of data is, in a more practical way, is what do you want to think about? Do I want to spend my time wondering about my own safety, about the safety of the people I'm with? Can I get data that's accurate, or do I want to just focus on the research? Then for me, it's come down to where do I really want to spend my time? What do I want to face every day in the research? And then I think will have the best research potential. And so for me, that's this summer in Mongolia. It may not be very developed, but certainly for research, it's open for researchers like us to engage and try and create new information about that environment. Thank you.